The Kaleidoscope.
Hey, it's your girl Sarah right here on the Kaleidoscope. Super excited to be here, and this is my final on the show. So I'm super excited to be here, like I said, obviously, because it's very fun to be here and talk to you about a lot of interesting things. It's very fun to, keep you educated and even tell you about what's currently happening right here in the UK and also everywhere else as well, right? Earlier, if you're just tuning in, for the past 2 hours, we were actually talking about fashion, the fashion industry, and we were talking about the post pandemic economy and what kind of economy we could expect and what kind of economy we need to look forward to as well. So, if you're just tuning in, a very good morning to you. I have a lot of things coming your way. So make sure you stay tuned for that. But also, if you have any messages, any thoughts that you would like to share with us, make sure you text me on 07852473473 and we can finally get into it because I'm super, super excited to do that. And my goal of being here, my purpose of being here is actually to share a holistic conversation, to share your thoughts and opinions with everyone listening in as well. Now, if you really like the content we have, if you like the things we talk about, you can find out more if you follow us on our socials, which is Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter and TikTok. And you can also keep yourself updated on what is happening around the world, but also right here on Relax Radio as well, because if you subscribe to our channels, if you follow us on our socials, you can actually keep yourself updated on our live shows, what's happening, and you can always watch it because that's what you should do. It'll be so amazing, and it's gonna make your day so much better, so make sure you do that. Okay, but we'll get into the topic that's something that really needs to be discussed, something that's very important in this day and age, which is actually freedom of speech, right? Now, obviously, we need to talk about freedom of speech because it's something that is very important, but also because a lot of us have questions about it, because a lot of us actually have questions as to whether freedom of speech, whether we actually have freedom of speech, whether we actually have the ability to do what we want to do, and whether we're unfairly restricted by our governments and by the people who are in charge of us, right? So obviously, another thing is, this is an age old question. We've all had huge questions about, what is freedom of speech? Do we actually have it? And if I were to put it simply, freedom of speech is actually a fundamental human right, and it is enshrined in Article 19 of the United Nations universal, or rather the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, in Article 19, you basically have it talks about freedom of expression and it talks about freedom of speech. Okay, so freedom of speech is basically the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds by any means. Okay, and the freedom of speech and the right to freedom of expression actually applies to ideas of all kinds, including those that may even be offensive, right? And this is why freedom of speech needs to be regulated. This is why, like, sometimes it needs to be restricted, because you can actually cause harm to people. It could also, it could result in a lot of other negative impacts. So that's why it's very, very important for you to make sure that for us to make sure that when it comes to freedom of speech, there is a lot of, that things are precise, and that it's very clear for people also about what they should say and what they shouldn't say, right? Because, like I said, when it comes to freedom of speech, you can say, you can say the most offensive things, but the thing is, you need to know that a lot of the things that you are given the freedom to say might offend a lot of people. It might hurt a lot of people, and it might even cause harm to a lot of people. So it's very important to be careful of what you say. Just because you have rights, it doesn't mean you have to misuse them, right? So obviously, this right actually comes with a lot of responsibilities. We have to be responsible for what we say. We have to, make sure we're saying the right thing. We need to always think twice before we talk. Something that our parents teach us when we're really small is to think twice before we talk, right? Think twice before we say anything, because I know my parents have taught us that, and sometimes they still do, because sometimes it's very easy for you to just say stuff without thinking, and it could actually harm people. But when you think twice and you say what you have to say, it doesn't really, not that it doesn't harm people, but when you think about it and say it, the chance of you doing harm is potentially lesser. So it's very important for you to do that. Now, when it comes to freedom of speech, it's also a very crucial element when it comes to democracy, because when you're in a democracy, you should be given the right to criticize your government. You should be given the right to ask your government, if you have any questions, if there's anything you need to ask. You need to ask them. You need to be able to do that without fear. You need to have the right to do that, right? Which is why freedom of speech is actually really, really important. So, like I said, it's a very crucial element of democracy, and it's also a basic character of personal development. Now, what that means is, obviously, as individuals, we need to be able to criticize, we need to be able to talk, we need to be able to express, and we need to be able to give our opinions. So obviously, it's very, very important that we're actually able to that we're given this right, because we need to make sure that we can use it for our personal development. And what I mean when I say that is, actually, it gives us the right to dissent, which is basically to disagree, and also the right to be heard. Okay, now, when you're living in a democratic society, you might be living in a different, group of people. And when I mean that, there are different ethnicities, there are different communities of people that live, from different ethnicities to different groups of people that have different sources of income. There are different ways in which you can actually be categorized, right? So because there is a lot of different people, there is a lot of different communities that are a part of society. You always need to make sure that you use your voice, you use your freedom of expression to bring focus onto the issues that your communities are facing, or even to question your governments and to hold them accountable, right? And obviously, freedom of speech has actually been recognized as something essential. It has been recognized as a basic human right in international and national laws, right? So, for example, if you take if you take Europe, it's protected by Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. That article actually talks about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and how every human being is actually granted the right to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And it is also the government's duty to actually uplift it, to make sure that they use the freedom of expression for the betterment of their people, and also to actually develop their governments. Because you understand that when we can criticize our governments, when we can tell our governments that they're doing something wrong, when we can hold our governments accountable for what they're doing, it means that then they actually have to change, then they actually have to work towards the betterment of the people. So it's very important when it comes to democracy that citizens out there, people out there, actually have they have the ability to change. They have the ability to question these governments and hold them accountable for everything they're doing. Now, that's why accountability is actually, or rather, this is why freedom of expression and freedom of speech are very, very important. And when it comes to freedom of speech, it also includes, and it also includes other rights like freedom of expression, or rather, freedom of speech or freedom of press, and the ability to communicate and have opinions without being in fear of those opinions that you have, right? And I know we've seen this in a lot of undemocratic countries. We've seen this in a lot of countries that have a dictatorship, or are a dictatorship. And we've seen how those people in those countries can't really criticize the governments, because if they do, they have to live in fear of their lives, or they go disappear, or they go missing, right? So obviously, then we understand that when it comes to democracy, being able to talk, being able to express oneself is actually very crucial. It's fundamental, and it is a basic human right that any human being should have, right? So that's what we'll be talking about today. Now, stay tuned, because I have a lot of things coming for you, coming your way rather, actually, based on freedom of speech, based on freedom of expression, and everything else that is related to freedom of speech, right? So I'll also be talking about the importance of freedom of speech, and the times in which it can be restricted, and how we have these laws in our country as well. So obviously, that's what we'll be talking about. But right now, let's head into a small break, because right after that, I'll be here to talk to you about freedom of speech and its importance, and everything related to expressing yourself.
And it gives them something to look at, and it makes them laugh. It makes them laugh, so that's why I do it. Oh, and it could be a really good pickup line as well. Girls, ladies who ask, "Hey, excuse me, so why are you wearing something so colorful?" I mean, hey, you can you can always have something up on your sleeve. I mean, got me thinking. You want to stand out. Why do you want to stand out though so much, especially with these kind of shirts when you're riding? There must be a purpose behind it, right?
Well, when you say a purpose, Nick, what I do, I wear the shirts mainly, one, because they're nice and bright, so they make me visible, especially if I'm riding on the road.
Okay. I mean, yeah, that's very important, right? Because you want cars, yeah.
Very important. And also, like, people see me in, like, calves, and perhaps I shouldn't be saying this on here, I suppose, but in the bar afterwards.
All right.
And it gives them something to look at, and it makes them laugh. So that's why I do it.
Oh, and it could be a really good pickup line as well. Girls, ladies who ask, "Hey, excuse me, so why are you wearing something so colorful?" I mean, hey, you can always have something up on your sleeve. I mean, you look like a guy who would do.
You know me too well. You know me too well, Nick.
Hey, it's your girl Sarah right here on the Kaleidoscope. Now, if you're just tuning in, a very good morning. We're talking about freedom of speech and whether it really exists in this day and age. Now, I'm super excited to be here because you're here on Relax Radio, where you just sit back, you relax, and you enjoy the conversation. Because right here on Relax, it's all positives and no negatives, okay? So make sure you stay tuned because I'm super excited to be here. I'm super excited to be telling you all of these things. And it's very, very exciting to be talking about things that are very important. And obviously, I want you to be a part of this conversation as well. So that's why we're talking about freedom of speech and its importance in this day and age. But right now, we'll be talking about but right now we'll be talking about the instances where the instances where freedom of expression has actually been restricted in the United Kingdom. Okay, because now, while understanding that freedom of expression is a very important human right, while understanding that it is very important for people in a democracy to have this right, we also need to understand that sometimes this right can actually be used to create a lot of bad, or to create a lot of negativity, to create a lot of disharmony, and to actually incite violence, right? And what I mean when I say that is actually, um, sometimes you can use words, you can use different things to actually hurt people and harm people, and negatively look down on the sort of oppression that they've had to go through, right? So obviously, when it comes to instances like that, free speech or the freedom of speech must actually be regulated. So there are some instances in which you can regulate free speech. There are some instances in which you can actually try to change these things and make sure that people are not, they're not trying to use the rights they've been given to actually incite violence and to create a lot of disharmony, right? So this is why we need to talk about the instances in which the freedom of speech can actually be restricted. So in UK, under Article 10 of the Human Rights Act of 1998, it actually states that freedom of expression may be subject to formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties if it causes harm to other people, or if it is more likely to cause harm to other people. And obviously, this is, saying a lot of things that could be racially, even religiously offensive to people. And because when you say things like that, it could possibly incite a lot of violence, it could incite a lot of chaos and destruction. That is one reason why you would actually restrict. That is one reason why you would actually restrict some of these rights, or some of the things that you can do when it comes to freedom of speech. So obviously, that is what that means. And these restrictions can also be in the interests of national security, in territorial integrity, or even public safety. So when it comes to protecting the national security of a country, when it comes to protecting the territorial integrity, or even the public safety of a country, a lot of people, or even a lot of, not necessarily a lot of people, but when it comes to protecting these interests, when it comes to making making changes to these and being aware of these, you can actually restrict free speech. You can put certain limitations on free speech just to make sure that none of these things happen. Because obviously, when you're ruling a country or when you're part of the government, number one thing that you always think about is national security. It's about the safety of the public, right? Because you need to always think about the citizens of your country. You need to make sure that the citizens of your country are protected. So because when you're thinking about things like that, obviously then you will restrict free speech, right? And also because governments actually have a certain obligation to prohibit hate speech and incitement, right? When we're talking about hate speech and we're talking about incitement of violence, it's very very important that governments actually actively take a role or play a role in trying to reduce this as much as possible and trying to restrict hate speech because of all the harm that it could cause. Now, it can also be justified in order, or rather, if they have to protect specific public interests or the rights and reputations of others. So, something that needs to be kept in mind when trying to restrict these limitations, when trying to restrict free speech, when you're imposing these limitations on free speech, is actually the fact that you need to be as clear and concise. As much as possible, right? Because something like free speech, it's a huge topic, right? And it can be very vague if you don't necessarily explain it correctly, or if you don't explain it concisely or clearly. It can be very vague and it can be very confusing. And that's why when it comes to certain rights like freedom of speech, when it comes to certain rights like freedom of expression, that's why it's very very important for you to actually make sure that you set it out in the most clear and concise way as much as possible, so it will help people understand, and there will definitely be less confusion about it, right? So that's why that needs to be kept in mind, right? And another thing is, when people or even governments impose these restrictions, they actually need to be able to demonstrate the need for these restrictions, and they also need to make sure it's proportionate. And what I mean when I say that is, they can't, make a certain sector of society have more freedom of speech than another sector of society, right? Because obviously that is not proportionate. And as a government, you actually have a role to play in making sure that all these laws you set out, all these laws you pass, all these acts you pass rather, is proportionate, and it actually helps a lot of people, and it helps to stop all this violence, and to make sure that it helps to keep public safety, national security at heart when they are making these changes, when they're trying to impose these restrictions, right? And there are quite a lot of laws in the UK for the for or rather against hate speech, to make sure that it's restricted as much as possible, and to make sure that there is no incitement of violence, or even incitement of violence, or even something that's offensive to people, right? So when we're talking about the laws, or rather the number of laws that the UK has to actually address these issues. Now we'll talk about section 4 of the Public Order Act, okay, which basically says that basically says that if it's very offensive for a person to use threatening, abusive, or insulting words, because it can cause distress to whoever they're insulting. Now, that's very important, because over the years, that has actually evolved to include a lot of other things like racial and religious hatred, and even language that encourages terrorism, right? And I'm talking about also, things when it comes to marginalized communities out there, like the LGBTQI plus community, and all those other communities out there that have been marginalized for a really long time, and are still, getting marginalized. It's very important that you make sure that these communities aren't necessarily they aren't violated, or you don't necessarily incite harm, not incite harm, but you don't cause harm to them, or make them feel uncomfortable, or like they are in trouble, right? Because like I said before, everyone out there has their we're our own individual. We all have our own freedom of speech. We all have the ability to make decisions. We all have the ability to give out our opinions, right? But we should always make sure that when we're giving out these opinions are actually for the betterment of everyone, and it's not necessarily to put someone down or to hurt people, because those people out there have also have some people out there could have been historically oppressed, right? So when you sort of make fun of that, when you make fun of it, or when you use that to insult people, it's definitely not like the best thing to do. So this is why freedom of speech needs to actually be monitored. It needs to be restricted, rather, because it can actually create a lot of disharmony, and it can include a lot of violence. So it's very, very important that we try to change this around and try to make sure that we achieve the best for everyone in society. Okay. And even now, something else that also needs to talk about is these laws have actually evolved over the years to include racial and religious hatred, and even language that encourages terrorism has actually been included in this as well. Right now, section 127 of the Communications Act is was actually where it actually says that if you send a message through a public electronic network that is deemed offensive or indecent, that you can actually be punished for it. Now, that is also another way in which you can actually restrict free speech, right? Because, like I said, if what you're doing or what you're saying is actually causing harm to other people, then it needs to be restricted. So that is very important. We need to understand that um that freedom of speech isn't actually an absolute right. Sure, we have freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean that we can use it to cause unrest. It doesn't mean that we can use it to incite violence and so on and so forth, right? So it's very, very important that you keep yourself in check, and you always make sure that you don't do this kind of thing, because it could potentially lead to you getting arrested and being jailed. So nobody wants that. Nobody wants to get arrested or end up in jail. So it's very important that you think twice before you talk, and you say what you need to say, but in a way that it doesn't cause harm to other people. Now, something else also that we need to talk about is the checks and balances on free speech. Now, that is very important. We really need to focus on how these checks and balances work when it comes to free speech, and how these some of these restrictions actually help to make it so much better for everyone. For everyone who is a part of the society, right? Because we understand that when it comes to society, it's not just you or me. It's a whole bunch of people. It's a whole community. There are so many different types of people. We need to respect everyone's needs. We need to respect everyone's histories and their backgrounds, and make sure that when we're talking to them, or when we're empowering them, or even when we're acknowledging them, that we don't do it in a way that is offensive for them. Okay, now if you're just tuning in, a very good morning. We're talking about freedom of speech, something that is very important in this day and age. Um, and if you have any opinions, any thoughts you would like to share with us, you can do so by just texting us on 078 52473473, and we will get in touch and talk about this, because it is something that would really I would really appreciate if you could share your thoughts with me, because your opinion matters. Okay, so that's what we were talking about. Now, when we're talking about these checks and balances, something we really need to do is be very specific about them. Now, I reiterated this earlier as well, because when you're not specific, when you're not talking about what needs to be talked about, there is a lot of issues because of that. Okay, so obviously, you really, really need to make sure that all the restrictions that you're imposing, all the things you're talking about, is actually as specific as possible. And we also need to understand that it would be very wrong to ban. So, for example, it would be very wrong for you to ban an entire website simply because there was one page that did something wrong, right? So, when you're even holding people accountable for some of the things they're doing, or when you're trying to impose these restrictions, you need to do it in a more in a very clear and concise manner, so that a lot of people wouldn't get confused, because after all, we're all people, we're all human. We're going to get easily confused if you put out a really vague law out there and expect people to understand, right? So you actually need to make sure what you're talking about when you're saying you're restricting certain actions, you're restricting certain phrases. What exactly are you talking about? And we also need to make people aware of what exactly is considered as hate speech, right? And another thing that needs to be kept in mind is also the fact that national security and public order should actually be precisely defined in the law, to prevent them from being used as excuses for excessive restrictions, right? Because a lot of the times we can just say I'm restricting we're restricting freedom of speech because of national security, or we're restricting freedom of speech because of public order, which really can be which can be misused a lot. So obviously it's very, very important that you use these as well, that you properly define these as well, right? Now, another thing that we obviously need to talk about is morals, right? How we need to make sure that these morals are also considered when you're imposing these restrictions. So obviously, when it comes to these restrictions, you can't base them on one single tradition or one single religion, because if you take a country has different types of religions, it has different types of traditions, and it has different types of people. So you also need to make sure you keep all of these things in mind. You need to make sure that you're thinking of all these people out there. You're thinking of everyone else who's out there, and their traditions and beliefs when you're setting out these laws, because it's not necessarily going to help anyone if by freedom of speech you're discriminating a certain specific, or you're discriminating a certain minority, or a certain community within the country, if it's simply just by saying, oh, I'm trying to restrict hate speech, but you're giving more freedom to one community than the other, then that's obviously very questionable, right? So that is very important as well. And another thing we also need to talk about is the rights and reputation of others. Now, when it comes to public officials, they need to, or they have to tolerate more criticism than private individuals, simply because they're public officials, which means that a lot of people will hold them accountable for what they're doing. A lot of people will actually try to make sure to make sure that they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that they are being held accountable for whatever they're doing. And that means that a lot of the defamation laws that they try to pass have to that they try to pass that stop the legitimate criticism of the government and of public officials is actually a violation to the right to free speech. Because if you're living in a democratic country, you need to be allowed to question your leaders, you need to be allowed to question the people in power, and you need to make sure that you can hold them accountable. But if there are laws out there that actually prevent you from doing this, if there are laws out there that prevent you from asking them to take responsibility or accountability and violates your free speech, then that is something that needs to be talked about as well, right? So obviously you need to keep these things in mind. And another thing that we need to talk about is the media and journalists. Now, we understand that when you have a career in media, when you have a career in journalism, your lives are definitely at more risk, and that is actually because they have to report the truth, they have to report information. And when it comes to information, sometimes they might put biased perspectives out there, because as much as we try, sometimes it's very hard to be unbiased. We're human, so we're very biased. So obviously, because of that, when it comes to the way they report and stuff, it's very hard for them to be unbiased, right? And sometimes when they're writing these articles, when they're expressing themselves, when they're putting out information for society to consume, that there might be instances where they might say the wrong thing, intentionally or unintentionally. But the thing is, their lives are at a lot of risk, and we've seen this throughout the world. We've seen how many or rather how much of risk the journalists have to go through because of the kind of jobs that they have, right? And therefore, we also need to understand that countries actually have an inherent responsibility to protect these people, to protect their right to freedom of expression, because ultimately, at the end of the day, these people also, they give information out to society. It's all about educating people, right? So make sure you stay tuned, because I'll be back in a few more minutes, back to talk about everything related to freedom of speech. So make sure you stay tuned, but let's head into this small break right now.
Kaleidoscope.
Hey, it's your girl Sarah right here on the Kaleidoscope, and we're getting into, the last few minutes of my final hour on the show. Now, if you're just tuning in, we were talking about freedom of expression and why freedom of expression is important and why it needs to be restricted. So that's what we were talking about earlier. Now, I'm super excited to be here, but also since we're having a very important conversation on freedom of expression, I would really love to know your opinions on it. I would really love to know your thoughts and ideas on it as well. So make sure you text to 07852473473, and you can actually help me with this conversation. You can help me, give everyone else or let everyone else know your ideas as well, because at the end of the day, your opinion matters. That's what this station is about. It's about everyone's opinion. It's about, all this amazing content. It's about getting to know everything that happens in the world. Okay, so let's get into why the freedom of expression is actually very important. Now, it's important because it's actually the foundation for a whole bunch of other rights. Now, when it comes to freedom of expression, it covers freedom of speech, it covers the freedom of press, and it also gives individuals the right to articulate their opinions without fear or retaliation, or even censorship and punishment. Right now, that's very important because, like I said earlier, when you're living in a democratic society, when you want to, hold your leaders accountable, when you want to make sure that they're doing what is best for the people, you obviously need to make sure that you obviously need to be make sure that you have the right to question them. And as public officials, they should also make sure that they can be questioned and that they don't pass laws or any type of other thing that requires or that basically violates your right to freedom of speech. Okay, now, like I said earlier, freedom of speech is not actually an absolute right. It doesn't mean that just because you have this right, you have like absolute freedom to say anything. It is, in fact, a restricted right, but having said that, it's very important that some of these restrictions actually stay in place because you can use some of the things you say to cause harm to people, to actually incite violence, and so many other things, right? So that's why it's very, very important for this to actually be restricted to a certain extent when it comes to certain instances, right? And another thing that we need to understand is that when it comes to freedom of expression, it actually covers everything from satire to political campaigns, right? And you need to definitely make sure that when we're talking about freedom of speech, that people actually have this right to express themselves. They have the right to receive and impart information and actually be a part of all these democratic processes as well, because that eventually helps us to that eventually helps us with the other rights as well. Because even though we don't actually sit and think about it, our right to expression is actually it actually intersects with a whole bunch of other rights, like some of the things we think, some of our beliefs, they actually very directly intersect with the freedom of speech, right? Now, another reason as to why it's important is because free press actually helps to inform the public. Now, freedom of expression is about, it's about media as well. It's about TVs, it's about newspapers, it's about radios, it's about everything. And therefore, we also understand that knowledge is power. So if knowledge is power, and we need knowledge to actually survive in this day and age, we need to be aware of what's happening. Without the free exchange of information, people cannot be fully aware of what's going on around them, right? And when they're not fully aware of what's going on around them, they can't participate in their communities and democracies. They can't make these changes because obviously it's very hard to make these changes because of the simple fact that they don't have enough information to make these changes, to make these decisions. And therefore, it's very important that freedom of expression exists because people need to make these decisions, they need to make these choices. And for them to do that, they need to be given enough information. And also, when the freedom of expression is respected, media companies can actually freely report on things like politics, on economics, and even other societal events. It's very, very important for us to do this. And another thing that obviously needs to be talked about as well is the fact that informed voters actually make stronger democracies. When people are more informed about what's going on around them, when people know what's going on around them, and when they're more aware of what kind of government is in power, what the government is doing to make sure their situation is better, what the government is doing to make sure that that they're making the lives better for their citizens, and citizens themselves knowing the fact that they can hold their governments accountable for whatever is happening in the country is very important for a strong democracy, because democracies depend, or rather democratic societies depend on people being able to hold informed opinions and express them. They depend on the ability of people to express their opinions, to tell them straight to the face, hey, look, this is what you're doing wrong. We need you to change this because you're in power, and this is what we're expecting from you. Okay, and we ourselves should also be able to question these people in power and ask them what they're doing. Like, hey, what are you doing to fix this problem? What are you doing to make this problem better, or what is your solution to this problem, right? And we also need to be able to find out any decisions that actually affect us, because at the end of the day, when we vote for these when we vote for our leaders, they also need to be held accountable, and to actually tell us what exactly is happening in our countries, right? So obviously, another thing that we also need to talk about is how freedom of speech and freedom of expression actually helps people to discuss and exchange their ideas. Now, that's very important, because when you're discussing and you're exchanging ideas, you really, really need to make sure that people have enough information, and they have enough information, and they can hold all these people out there accountable for whatever they're doing. Okay, that's why freedom of expression and freedom of speech is really important. And finally, we it also gives a platform to other human rights. And when we're talking about other human rights, we need to make sure that we are focusing on these people, because ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're in a marginalized community, if you're in a discriminated society, the only way you will get recognition is through freedom of speech. If you can talk about your issues openly to your politicians, to tell them, look, this is what you're doing wrong, we need you to do something about it, then that is how we know that these marginalized communities, their voices are heard, the abusers and the problems they go through are heard as well. So obviously, it's very, very important for them to make sure they do that. And this is why it's very important that freedom of expression actually exists in this day and age, because we need to have stronger democracies. We need people to come up and talk about the things that are bothering them, and also to make sure that they can hold all these other people or their leaders out there accountable. So that is what it is on the end of Kaleidoscope right here on Relax Radio. I'm Sarah, and I'm so excited to have kept you company for the past 3 hours. Make sure you stay tuned, because we have Jamie on the chat trap next, and she'll be talking about a lot of interesting stuff. So make sure you stay tuned for that. But I will catch you soon tomorrow. But until then, I hope you have an amazing day, and bye. I really hope you have an amazing day.